Is Seele worth pulling on a rerun? Now, ignoring any potential leaks, if she has a rerun, let's go over hypothetical. Is she worth pulling as of right now, especially once you have other units like Blade, with units like Kafka or Danheng? Is she worth it overall in comparison to her initial release? And should you go for something like her Light Cone over Eidolons? And at what point, if you're going for Eidolons, should you stop? I'm going to phrase you a temporary hypothetical here. That's being you have Silverwolf to pair up with Seele. You have somebody like Fu Xuan in a mono quantum team just because you might want to fill out that roster. And you have Lynx as the abundance 4-star. And I'm saying Lynx because Lynx is actually, as a 4-star unit, more obtainable than characters like Bailu, Luocha, and so on. Even without those prerequisites, she is still a good character. However, the value she has in comparison to somebody else like Danheng is a bit iffy. She doesn't have the AoE, and her resurgence proc, which essentially is the entirety as to why she's so good, because any character can deal good damage, but the fact that she takes multiple actions per turn and can get more value from buffs like Ting Yun or Bronya makes her extremely viable. If she does not defeat an enemy and get this resurgence, which is the extra turn, then her value drops a little bit. Whereas somebody like Blade or Danheng may have the ability to have essentially a large AoE attack, which is a bit better than somebody like Jing Yuan's follow-up attack, she is reliant on that resurgent proc. And in comparison to the likes of Blade and Danheng, she arguably uses up the same or similar amounts of skill points. This is because she wants to use her skill pretty much all the time. Even though resurgence does buff her damage overall by 70% at level 8, you primarily will be using her skill, meaning that you get 1 skill point usage here, you proc resurgence, get another skill point usage, which is technically 2 skill points. Now, if you kill something with her elemental burst or her ultimate, that is going to be another skill point if you choose to use a skill afterwards. Now, you can go something like a normal attack or a basic into a skill once you get that resurgence, into an ult, into a basic again. But for the most part, the vast majority of you will be utilizing her with her skill. And that means that it does put her on par, at least in some instances, with somebody like Danheng, except she doesn't have the ult to offset that skill point drain. With that being said, as a character overall, she is still great. Now, if you're looking at her Light Cone, I'd actually say that even though it does give you a decent amount of crit, and the basic attack and skill damage, as well as the ult damage up is nice, I'd say that you should ideally prioritize something like her E1 and then E2 first and foremost. E1, 80% or below, you essentially get the crit that her Light Cone would give you regardless, which makes it a bit easier to build her out. And then at E2, you're getting an additional stack of her skill effect. Now, for those of you who don't know, her skill is essentially increasing her speed by 25%, so additional stack means 50% speed in total. The problem with that, and I think I want a lot of individuals to focus inherently on this, is that Seele has pretty decent base speed. If you're adding on 50% bonus speed, it takes her up to a point where it's very difficult to speed tune units like Yukong or Bronya around her. My Bronya has 141 speed, my Yukong has 131 speed. Now, yes, I understand my Bronya's relics could be a little bit better, especially if I get speed substats here and there, but overall, it's more difficult to speed tune around an E2 Seele because of the immense amount of stats she already has. At 115 base speed, you're adding in, let's say hypothetically, additional 60 or an additional, we'll even just say 55 speed. Then you're already sitting at 150 speed, which is above my Bronya. That's after 2 skill uses. In addition to and ignoring any speed substats you may have. So why would you go for it? Well, the benefit is you can run attack stands or attack boots on her. Sorry, Genshin Brain. You can run attack boots on her. If you avoid speed substats, you're in a better position than I am, at least, as you see here. But it allows you to run attack boots without losing out on too many actions, and it allows you to get the maximum effect because this Light Cone wants you to have, essentially, since you can gain 6 stacks and each stack is dependent on 10 speed, 160 speed, E2 is almost necessary unless you get really lucky with subset rolls and speed boots to get the maximum value out of this Light Cone. So I'd say prioritize E1 and 2 before going for her Light Cone. Whereas if you were to go for something like Cruising in the Subtle Seas or even River Flows in Spring or Swordplay, all of these have less conditional effect. If you have Swordplay, I'd say go for it because Seele's skill hits 3 times. That's 3 stacks of Swordplay. And you don't have to deal with the conditional effect of having speed as a requirement to get the bonus. Even though it doesn't give crits, it is arguably easier to get crits than it is to get 160 speed. And if you're going at that, and if you are, let's say hypothetically, you're avoiding her light cone entirely, you have swordplay, you have a different light cone that you already have built up, and her build is pretty settled, and you have attack boots that you can't slide onto her, what should you do then? Well, it's a bit iffy. Because Seele is a character who depends inherently on killing your enemy, if you can't, the value of a lot of her abilities and the value of a lot of her stats and eidolons does diminish a little bit. 80% HP less, perfectly fine, just consider it 15% bonus crit. 25 additional speed, it's quite nice. The additional 40 energy means you can spam her ult because her ultimate itself doesn't have a very high cost, and she does get quite a lot of energy to begin with just from using a skill. So additional 15 energy when she defeats an enemy is nice, but in boss battles where you want to be targeting that boss individually, this doesn't have as big of an effect. E6 is essentially make or break. It's a great eidolon, but I would personally say, as somebody who has E2 Seele and E6 Silverwolf, it is arguably better to go for something like an E2 Seele with an E2 Silverwolf and then get eidolons on the rest of her supportive roster than to just max her out. Yes, her ultimate damage is quite nice. Don't get me wrong. It's a decent chunk of her damage overall. But if you're ideally looking at building out a quantum team and you're getting the most value of your units, Seele, her eidolons are dependent on her defeating an enemy, specifically this E4. Whereas if you're looking at Silverwolf, E1 and E2 are quite nice. E1 can let you be a bit more lenient on energy regeneration rate. E2 means effect resistance and effect hit rate can be lowered a little bit. E4 and E6 stack up with the amount of debuffs the opponent has. So as you see here, my Silverwolf is E6, she has a cincher, and for traces, she's fully maxed out. My Silverwolf is pretty well built. So I'd say overall, E2 and E2 for both of these units are quite good. They're quite fine. When Fushuan releases, if you want to go for something like Eidolon 1 to 2 on her, it might be a decent pick overall. I'd say for Seele, Eidolons are worth prioritizing over Light Cone. E2, then Light Cone, and then you can go for something else. With Silverwolf, it's the opposite. Eidolons are worth prioritizing pretty much all the time over her Light Cone because her Light Cone doesn't give her energy regeneration rate like her, free Light Cone that you have, which is the one I have on my Pela. E1 takes care of those energy regen needs. You can obviously pair them together for ult spam, but it isn't necessarily better. So, is Seele worth picking up on a rerun? I'd say yes. Her value has held long term. She is still a good character. I would, however, say that if you are facing off or if you're building out a team and you are looking more towards AoE potential, it might be a better idea to consider something like Blade Eidolons or Danheng Eidolons or even Kafka Eidolons over somebody like Seele because she is largely a single target character. She's like the Yanqing of Quantum. She's very good, very easy to build, and kind of flexible, and she does heal high amounts of damage, but she's so single target oriented that if you have a really high potential Blade or really high investment Danheng, they can arguably be better than her. However, her supportive units, your Silverwolves, your Lynx, your Fushuan, may be better suited overall to pick up Eidolons on, especially if they're more flexible. Silverwolf is more flexible in other teams than a Seele, especially given how skill point hungry Seele is. So, in that position, in that instance, you can prioritize Silverwolf Eidolons or Eidolons on supports rather than your DPS. If you were to look at my account and just say who I'd recommend, I would recommend getting up Eidolons on essentially any support you can. Whether that be your Nihility characters if you don't intend on using them as a main DPS or as your main on-fielder, whether that's your supportive debuffers, whether that's your buffers like Baranya, doesn't matter. I would say your supports are going to help you a lot more than your DPS. Yes, you can get one DPS, max them out to the high heavens, and they will carry you, but that's only in one team. Whereas if you're dealing with other supports, they can slide around a bit more flexible and a bit more fluidly and work better overall. But that's just my opinion. If you have Eidolons on Seele and you want to share your thoughts, go ahead and do that down below. I just would say prioritize Eidolons over her Light Cone until you get to E2. Once you get to E2, her Light Cone has a bit more value, but I wouldn't say it's so far above the likes of a swordplay, especially at S5. And if you are looking at and considering Eidolons on your support, specifically a Silverwolf, that has a bit more value in comparison to just Eidolon or S1 Seele. Regardless, if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing, leave a like down below, and I'll see you next time. Good luck on whatever you pull for.